Let's talk some chess. This game was played almost 60 years ago in Cleveland, Ohio. It's part of a Simul, or simultaneous exhibition. The way that works is a very strong player, in this case Bobby Fischer, plays with the white pieces on multiple boards and plays with opponents that are not necessarily as good at chess, but hopefully they can win with strength in numbers because they're all playing Bobby at once. In this case, the opponent is Jay Gloger. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of Jay Gloger, but we do have the details of this game, and Bobby kicks us off with b4. This is the Polish opening, and it's not a very common opening played today, I think, or even back then. In a more serious game, Bobby would probably play with the D and E pawns or develop a knight on the first move. But this is a Simul, and maybe he wants to have some fun and try something new. So we have b4 on the board for Bobby. e5 by Gloger. This develops a central pawn and also opens up a discovered attack from the dark squared bishop to the pawn on b4. So a nice move, establishing a presence in the center, and you have a discovered attack on Bobby's pawn. Bobby ignores the pawn for now, fianchettos his bishop on b2, and this comes with an attack on Gloger's pawn in the center. So you could just trade pawns here and that would be fine, but instead Gloger wants to protect this central pawn and plays f6, adding some protection in the center. Bobby continues to ignore his pawn on b4 and just plays e4, preventing the march of this e5 pawn and creating a lane for his light squared bishop to develop if it so chooses. We have bishop to b4 by Gloger, so now picking up the free pawn that Bobby neglected to protect, but now Bobby doesn't really care about that. He plays bishop to c4, and now this bishop is, the light squared bishop is super powerful, and the dark squared bishop, if these pawns ever get broken up or move, will also become very powerful on this long diagonal. So already looking a bit tough for Jay Gloger. Here we have knight to e7, and this is a fine idea. You're developing a piece, but the problem is it allows an immediate check by Bobby. It allows queen to h5, and this is why you always want to be careful playing f6, or playing even d6, because then you allow, after some, especially f6, let's just look at f6 for now, after white moves the e-pawn, which is very common in the opening, you allow this really nice tempo queen check to h5. And this is pretty annoying already. You have the queen obviously checking the king, but the bishop is joining in as well. And this, things can get ugly if you're not careful here. In this case, Gloger played knight to g6, so maybe this was the idea behind putting the knight on e7, sort of anticipating this move. The better move here is actually to play g6, blocking the queen. This obviously comes with an attack on the queen. So here the queen retreats to f3, which is the square that makes the most sense. But now you can put the rook on f8, and this is a much more robust defense than sort of what happened. So instead we get the knight on g6, and Bobby now plays f4. And again, this f4 move would have been impossible if Gloger protected with g6 and then the queen came to f3. Then in this case you obviously cannot play f4. But the knight's on g6, and now the pawn is on f4, and it's attacked by the pawn here on e5. It looks like it's attacked by the knight, but another issue with blocking with the knight is now the knight is pinned to the king, so it's not a very effective piece. And Bobby obviously, let's say you just ignore this pawn, then Bobby's threatening f5, and you pick up the knight, which is pinned to the king, and that's no fun. So Gloger just captures, captures on f4. But now the issue is, well, there's a couple of issues, but with each of these pawns that sort of move away from this diagonal, this dark squared bishop gets more and more powerful. And this light squared bishop is already super powerful, so you really have to be careful about unleashing Bobby's forces. We have knight to f3 by Bobby, developing a piece. Knight to c6, Gloger has a moment to sort of play normally, and now knight to c3, developing the final piece. And getting ready to bring this to awesome squares like d5, maybe even b5, moving up the board with intention. I set that up very terribly. Gloger, of course, does not want that, so he just exchanges the dark squared bishop. This bishop wasn't doing too much. It wasn't really part of any attack, whereas this knight has real ambition to move up the board. So bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and now Bobby has this really wonderful bishop pair, and this is going to be a problem to deal with. So d6 is played by Gloger, preparing to get his own light squared bishop into the game. probably wants to castle queenside as well. There's a lot of pressure on the king side. You can't castle kingside right now because the light squared bishop is obviously preventing that. So maybe wants to develop his pieces on the queen side and castle queenside, but there's not really going to be time for that because Bobby jumps into it with knight to h4. And again, whenever you see a pinned piece, you want to do your best to attack it. And here, the way to attack it is by bringing the knight to h4. Generally, you don't want to see your knights on the sides of the board because they're obviously attacking less squares. Here, this knight is only controlling 4 squares, as opposed to in the center of the board, it's controlling 8 squares. But there's always a time and a place for pretty much every move in chess. And in this case, knight to h4 attacks the knight, which is pinned on g6. So here we have knight to c7, adding a protector to this, this poor pinned knight. But now notice that Gloger has wasted sort of 4 different moves on both of these knights. When he could have developed, or the bishop or the queen, and gotten his pieces out, whereas Bobby has all of these pieces out, ready to go, ready to castle either side, instead of sort of moving the same piece over and over. So just a good lesson that we see very often in chess. We have knight to f5 now by Bobby. So basically use that opportunity, bringing the knight to h4 to waste one of his opponent's moves, bringing the knight back to e7, forcing retreat, and now the knight can come to f5, which is obviously a fantastic square for the knight. You're threatening the g7 pawn. This comes with check, and so you have to really be careful here. And in this case, Gloger actually makes the correct move, which is king to f8. Breaking the pin of this knight, you want this knight to be a good defensive piece. Now, knight takes is not as good because you can take back with the queen or the knight. So this actually, knight captures is not as good in this case. You want to sort of bring your king to safety or relative safety and unpin the queen to the knight here. So Gloger makes a move to sort of strengthen the position of the king. Bobby is able to strengthen the position of the king much better because Bobby can castle kingside, and now this king is super safe. So that's kind of a saucy little combination of moves that, like, king to f8, king is a little bit safer, but not much safer, and then castles kingside. And it's almost like bragging, like, look, I can castle. This is much more fun. So I thought that was sort of funny. We have queen to e8 here by Gloger, and this looks like a really reasonable defensive move. You basically replace the king on e8 with the queen, and now the queen is protecting the knight. It's actually lining up with the enemy queen, so if this knight moves away, then you have a discovered attack from queen to queen, and this white queen is undefended, so that that's a serious threat. Maybe a queen trade is in the works. It looks like a very good move. But unfortunately, this was actually the move that really lost the game. Gloger in this position is actually okay. You can defend properly here. It's hard to defend, of course, against Bobby Fischer, but you can defend properly here. But this was the move that sort of sunk the position. So see if you can find Bobby's next move while I give you a moment. Okay, so we talked all game about how this dark squared bishop on c3 was super powerful, or how the potential becomes super powerful. And we're not going to see it just dominating this diagonal as we see in some other games that Bobby has. But it is going to be put to good use here by sacking it on f6. So bishop takes on f6, and this is this is annoying. You've taken away the f-pawn, so now the king has less protection. If you don't deal with this threat, let's say you just develop this bishop, you could even just retreat the bishop to b2, and now this bishop is super powerful, controlling this entire diagonal. So this is super annoying to deal with, and instead of taking it right away, Gloger actually first takes on f5 with the bishop. So removing the knight from f5, this is taking away one attacking piece, because now you are threatening, Bobby's threatening in this position. Bishop takes knight, and this would come with check, and because the knight is protecting the knight. I haven't looked into that. I don't know how effective that would be, or even probably more effective. Yeah, more effective is bishop takes on g7 with check, because the knight protects g7 as well. So Gloger doesn't want to go into that, and we just have bishop takes knight on f5. And Bobby takes back, so e takes on f5. And now Gloger has a nice in-between move, d5. And this is a nice looking move. You could just take back the bishop here. It seems you could just take that back. But first, let's try to cut off the sort of the razor, this long square or this light squared bishop that has a long sort of reach into the enemy camp. And d5 forces Bobby to make a decision. You can't capture back because the knight is defending this pawn on d5. And it seems like this has stemmed the tide of the attack for a moment. But Bobby actually doesn't care. It's said that his favorite piece is this light squared bishop, but in this case, not as much. Again, there's a time and place for everything in chess, and here he just takes the knight on g6. So this is a really funny position where both of Bobby's bishops are hanging to pawns, and he has just totally ignored it because he's really intent on getting this pawn to g6, and his queen and pawn are going to be very important in the attack, and for the moment he doesn't care as much about these bishops. So here Gloger has the choice of two bishops to capture, goes for the bishop on f6. So, again, we saw Bobby sort of sack this bishop on f6 earlier. It took a little bit of time for that sack to be accepted, but it is accepted on f6. And, you might be thinking, is there a better move in this position? And the answer is there's not. Let's say you try to take the pawn on g6, this is now a very powerful pawn, of course. Let's say you try to take that on g6. Then you just get queen takes rook, checking the king. King has to move to f7, and now queen to g7 check. The bishop is protecting the queen, and this just looks very not good and no fun. So that doesn't work. Another option, which I have here, instead of taking the bishop on f6, another option is to play h6, right? So now you're sort of, eliminating the power of this pawn on g6. The queen is sort of shut out of the game because this pawn can't move. But this doesn't work either. You get bishop takes on e7 with check, and after king takes, queen takes on d5. And now Bobby is up a bishop, and the king is stuck on e7. This bishop and queen have an excellent battery. The rook can come into the game and check the king and pick up the queen. So this is terrible as well. Here after queen to d7, the rook comes over, and this just does not look good at all. So that doesn't work either. The last thing you can do, instead of taking the bishop, the last move that looks reasonable is knight takes on g6. But this doesn't work either. You get bishop takes on d5. Now that the knight is no longer protecting the d5 pawn, and now after you finally accept the bishop sack on f6, you get queen to h6 with check, and now this is a huge problem to deal with. The king has to run to e7, and now the rook comes to e1, and you're picking up the queen after the king moves away. So that, I think that's the end of that line. Yeah, rook takes queen. So that doesn't work either. So, we can't really fault Gloger here for picking up this bishop. That is the best move in the position. But now Bobby, because you've moved away from the g7 square with this pawn, Bobby's able to infiltrate with queen to h6 check. And now this is really frustrating to deal with. You have the pawn cutting off f7. You have the queen checking the king. So the only move here is king to g8. But it almost looks like for a moment, if you look at this position, it's kind of hard to figure out how to continue the attack from here. So you certainly have a queen in a very advanced position. You have a pawn in a very advanced position. The bishop is cut off right now. It's blocked by a pawn, and it can't really do anything. And Gloger does have some defensive pieces in the vicinity. So see if you can take a moment and find the move that ended the game, that won the game for Bobby. After he played this, Gloger resigned, while I give you a couple of seconds. Okay, let's go through some of the moves that it is not. So I think the move that looks most intuitive to me is just pawn captures on h7 with check. This looks very good. You've got check from the pawn. You've got the queen, this way. But this doesn't work at all after rook takes on h7. Now the queen is under attack, and there are actually, the only square that the queen can go to without being captured is just f4. But now the attack is over. The bishop is hanging, and it's Gloger's move. So the bishop is hanging, and yeah, there's no more attack, and the attack has completely petered out. So it doesn't work to take on h7. A move that does work, but is not as cool as what Bobby played, is bishop takes on d5 with check. So if you saw that, that's fine as well. You get this obviously is checking the king. The king has no squares to move to, so you can only accept the sacrifice with knight takes on d5. But then we get into the main idea, which I'm not going to spoil here. The correct move, or the move that, I think it's the correct move, and what Bobby played in this position, what ended the game, is actually g7. And this is a I mean, this is just an amazing looking move. It looks like it completely shuts the queen out of the attack. The bishop is still hanging, so the bishop can be captured. And it doesn't look like it achieves anything because, you know, the pawn is not checking the king. It's sort of letting the king escape to f7. And, you know, generally sometimes when you push these pawns too far, you close the attacking channels and, you know, you have no more chances to checkmate the king. So, again, time and place for everything, right? And sometimes certain moves that are not traditionally good work, and in this case, you know, this move works. So let's see why this move works. Which line do we want to do here? So whenever you make a move like this, you have to think like, what's the threat? What's, you know, if nothing is done, what's being threatened here? So let's say that Gloger just plays a6, totally ignoring what's going on. Then you get queen takes on f6, and now now you have to move the knight to, well, we'll see why. You have to move the knight to g6, but now you get bishop to d5 with check, and now the only thing that works is to give up the queen, and now bishop takes, and this is checkmate. One sec. Why do we need to move the knight? One moment. So we have to move the knight. I'm just gonna look at Stockfish. One sec. Pretend I'm not doing this. Okay. Yeah, that's why. That was dumb. I should have realized that. Okay. So you have to move the knight to g6 because it prevents the pawn capturing and promoting on h8. Let's say you ignore this again, and now you play. Pawn captures on h8, rook or queen, whatever comes up. Let's do a rook because that's cooler. This is checkmate. The king is super checked and can't escape whatsoever. So you have to put the knight on g6 to protect this, but now because the knight is gone from e7, it's not protecting d5 anymore. Bishop takes with check, and now the king has no squares to go to. You have to block with the queen, and then this is checkmate. So that was the line that I had prepared, or I thought I had prepared, but didn't see. Hopefully that made sense. So that's the threat, right? When you play this g7, that's the threat, is the queen coming over to f6, which protects the h8 promotion square, the queening square, or the rook square, and you have to deal with that. So we'll talk about the best way to deal with that. No, we don't want to do that. What do I want to do here? Okay, the best way to deal with that. Wait, what do I want to do here? Yeah, that's what I want to do. Yeah, the best way to deal is actually queen to g6. And this is kind of sad. You're just giving up a queen, but this is really the only way to prevent the white queen from capturing on f7. So queen to g6 is the move, but then you just promote anyways. Pawn takes on h8. Queen or rook, doesn't matter. King has only one square to move to, but you pretty much have to accept the you have to take the queen, so king takes queen, but now queen takes queen, knight takes, and bishop takes on d5. Even if you take with the pawn, doesn't matter. The bishop can just retreat. And any of these permutations, any of these lines, Bobby is just up a rook when it's all said and done, so that doesn't work at all. So yeah, that's after this g7 move. Bobby's threatening to capture on f6 and then promote with checkmate on h8. And it's also the same thing if you take the bishop on c4 and just ignore, then you get the same idea. Make sure that's right. Yeah. Then you get the same idea, queen to f6, and now, wait, actually, is this right? Oh, interesting. Okay, I didn't do this line. Okay, let's talk about that line. Sorry, I'm like all over the place. So let's say pawn captures bishop, then you get queen takes on f6 with the same idea, and now after knight to g6, protecting the queening square, now rook takes on f4. And now what you're threatening is, well, what are you threatening here? Yeah, okay. What you're basically threatening is the only thing that's keeping this queening square safe is the knight on g6, so there's really no way to stop this rook to g4 and then capturing the knight, and then Bobby will take on the queening square and the game will be over. So sorry for all the back and forth. I thought I looked at all those lines, but hopefully that all makes sense. Basically, after this g7 move, you have to stop this threat of queen to f6 and then promotion on h8 with checkmate. The only way to do that is queen to g6, but after all the trades and all is said and done, Bobby is just up a rook, and that's fine. So hopefully that made sense. Sorry for all the runaround. I want to go back to one point in the game. There was one point where there was one point where you could have defended a little bit better, but it's not here. Where is it? Okay, yeah, it's here, it's here. So if we remember this point, Gloger had just moved the king to f8, trying to get it a bit safer. It's unpinned from the knight, but Bobby still has all these forces sort of bearing down. The move that was played here was queen to e8, and I mentioned that this was the losing move in the game. The proper move here is actually queen to d7, and this is interesting. It doesn't really look as effective. You're not protecting the knight on g6. You are attacking the knight on f5, which is good, but it doesn't look as good. But this actually works totally fine. If Bobby tries to do the same bishop sack on f6, then after pawn takes and queen to h6, the same idea from before. The crucial difference here is that the king can escape to the queen side. So the king can move to e8 because there's no queen on e8. And now after knight to g7, the king can escape even further to d8. And now the attack is over. So that's the idea, is you need to get the queen off the back rank so that the king has some squares to escape to and survive. But unfortunately here, in trying to protect the position, the queen actually blocked the escape route for the king, and that is what really ended the game. So yeah, let me go to the final mating picture, or the final move was this g7 move, which is a very nice move. Thanks for watching. Sorry for all the runaround. Hopefully it made sense, even though I had to double check with Stockfish midway through. But really appreciate you watching. Drop a like, drop a subscribe. Let me know of any other games you want to see reviewed, and I'll see you next time.